Okay, today we're going to be learning Yevamot Daf Nun. We're going to start the 5th chapter. I will warn you, today's daf is not as simple as yesterday's was, as I warned you yesterday. But we will, again, what I want to always say in these kind of dafim is the main thing is to get the concepts, even if you don't get each and every case, although the truth is once you get the concepts, you can kind of figure out each case, but don't get too bogged down by all the details. Kind of try to remember the concepts that we'll go through as we learn. Today's daf is dedicated in honor of John and Yael Cohen on their 24th wedding anniversary. Mazal tov. Okay, we are going to get started with, we want to finish up first the end of the chapter, which we started yesterday. We were in the middle of this Megillat Yuchsin, that we saw a different version of the one mentioned in the Mishnah, or not a different version, but just more detail of this Megillat Yuchsin, and 3 things that were in it as opposed to the one mentioned in the Mishnah. And we had that one of the things was that Menashe, the king, killed Yeshayahu. And the question is, why did he kill him? Well, again, the reasons given was that he put him on trial for 3 things that he went against the Torah. Okay, interesting that they kind of put it as Moshe Rabbeinu said this, and you said this, even though, right, it wasn't always Moshe Rabbeinu, it was the Torah. But anyway, the 3rd thing we were trying to grapple with was, it says, Et mispar yamecha amalei, in Shmo Kaf Gimel, it says, your days will be filled out, meaning you have a particular amount of days that you're meant to live. And Yeshayahu came and went to Chizkiyahu when he was sick, and he said to him, right, because what happened was Chizkiyahu got sick, and then he prayed to God, and then Yeshayahu said, because you prayed to God, you will now get an extra 15 years. So we're going to see that those 15 years turned out to be very important because Menashe was born within those 15 years. Okay, so, which is interesting, by the way, that Menashe is complaining about this when actually, if he hadn't gotten those extra 15 years, he would never have been alive. Maybe that's part of the issue that he had here. I don't know why exactly, but maybe there's some connection. Now, how do we know Menashe was born in those 15 years? This kind of is going to come up at the end of the sugya, but they don't really tell you how we know this, but we know it and we'll tell you why. Chizkiyahu was given 15 more years to live. Then Chizkiyahu dies. And then it says that Menashe ruled, and he was 12 years when he became king. So you can do the math. It's pretty simple. He obviously was born within those last 15 years of Chizkiyahu's life, which means if Chizkiyahu hadn't been living those 15 years, Menashe would never have been born. So that's just a little bit of background to something we're going to see later. So how could it be that you have a set amount according to Moshe, and Yeshayahu said you're going to get an extra 15 years? So Tinahi, it's actually a machloket Tanaim. What's a machloket? It's a machloket about how to explain this. Okay, how could it be? Because again, now what are we trying to do? Yeshayahu didn't defend himself, but what could he have said to defend himself? He could have said the following: one of 2 options. Titanias, it says in a braita, Et mispar yamecha amalei, elu shnei dorot. Those are the years that you're meant to live. Zacha mashlimim lo, lo zacha pochatim lo. You have 2 possibilities in your life. Either you'll get to them, that's if you're worthy. If you're not worthy, you'll end up dying earlier. Divrei Rabbi Akiva, that's Rabbi Akiva's approach. So that's one approach. So one approach is to say, Chizkiyahu was punished and he was supposed to die younger. Because he did tshuva and he went back and prayed to God, he got back to the amount of years he was actually meant to live in the first place. Chachamim omrim, zacha mosifim lo, lo zacha pochatim lo. Now, there's 3 options. Either regular person just lives out their life the way they're supposed to. If you're very extra worthy, you get extra years on that. If you're less worthy, you lose years. So according to this option, Chizkiyahu actually got an extra 15 years. So there's 2 ways to approach it, which is, yes, everyone agrees there's a set amount of years, but that set amount of years is not set in stone, as they say, and it can be played with. So it's just a matter of how can it be played with and which way. Rabbi Akiva. So now we see this discussion in this braita between Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis. So everyone tries to prove their point. So the rabbis say to Rabbi Akiva, it says very clearly in the pasuk, I added to your days, right, to the amount of years you were meant to live. I added 15 years. So that sounds pretty clear that this was added. Amar lahem, Rabbi Akiva says, what are you talking about? Mishalo sifulo. What does it mean I added? I added to the days that were taken off. I now put them back, and I added to get to what you originally were at. Can't prove anything from that. And not only that, Teda. And I'll prove to you that, like, let's say, I don't remember what age he was, but whatever age he was, let's say he was 70 when he died. So, and this was at age 55, he gets an extra 15 years. I'll tell you that it's clear those 70 years he was meant to live were clearly years he was meant to live from the first place. Meaning, right, I'm going to prove my point that with the 15 years he got were part of the 70 he was supposed to have in the first place. How do I know this? Okay, this is all happening at the end of Sefer Melachim, the beginning of Sefer Melachim, Aleph. Okay, this is the end of Melachim Bet. We're near toward the end of the king's time period. I'm just going to remind you, Chizkiyahu was the father of Menashe, who was the father of Yoshiyahu. Now, in the beginning, when the kingdom is split, after Shlomo HaMelech, there's the split between Yeravam and Rechavam. So when the kingdom is split, there's this nivuah that happens. Hine ben nolad lebeit David, Yoshiyahu shmo. They give a prophecy about Yoshiyahu, who's going to be living, right, many generations later. Now, if you want to say that Chizkiyahu was only meant to live again, I gave random numbers. I probably should have checked, but let's just assume, right? Chizkiyahu was 70 years, and now we have he was, let's say, really only meant to live 55 years according to the rabbis, and he got an extra 15. Well, what did I tell you? Menashe was born in the last 15 years of his life, right? 12 years before the end, which means that it can't possibly be that many generations ago there was a prophecy about Yoshiyahu, when Yoshiyahu's father was supposed to be born in year 58 of Chizkiyahu's life, and Chizkiyahu was meant to die in year 55. That makes absolutely no sense. If it was prophesied that he would have a son, right, a grandson from the Chizkiyahu would be Yoshiyahu, and Yoshiyahu's father hadn't even been born within the years that were designated to Chizkiyahu in the first place, there's no way that could have happened, that could have been. So therefore, he proves it's clear, since Yoshiyahu was born within those, Menashe was born in those 15 years, it's clear that those 15 years must have been part of the original plan. And that Chizkiyahu was really meant to live 70. He got punished and was going to only live 55, and then he got back his 15 years, and that's Rabbi Akiva's proof. Question is that a good enough proof? So what are the rabbis going to say to this? So again, it says, Hinenu ben nolad ben David, lebeit David, Yoshiyahu shmo, va'adayin lo nolad Menashe. That's his claim. So the Rabbanan, what will they say? Miktiv michizkiyahu, lebeit David ktiv. It doesn't say a son, a grandson will be born to Chizkiyahu, and his name will be Yoshiyahu. Yoshiyahu was maybe going to be born from, if Chizkiyahu really died at age 55, the way he was meant to, according to the rabbis, right, before he got these 15 years, maybe Yoshiyahu would have been born to somebody else, whoever took over the kingdom from Chizkiyahu, whoever that would have been, some other relative of his. Then they would have taken over. They would have had a son named Yoshiyahu. Who's to say that Yoshiyahu had to come from Chizkiyahu? So that doesn't prove anything. So imi Chizkiyahu nolad imi ina shachrina. Could have been born from Chizkiyahu, could have been born from somebody else. Okay. Now, Ishto Shemeta. Okay, now we have to go back before we finish the chapter. We're going to go back to the second part of the Mishnah. First part of the Mishnah was all about mamzer. What's the definition of a mamzer? And then we got into this proof from the Megillat Yuchsim for the Shita of Rabbi Yeshua. Now, I see, Gita, you put up that he must have lived 51 years. He was 51 when he died. Wow, that's really not a lot, considering he got an extra 15 or 54, you said? Okay. So 54, thank you. Okay. So now we have this case in the Mishnah that was really kind of unnecessary. It's unnecessary for two reasons. The whole end of the Mishnah is all about a sister. Remember the whole sister thing? Sister, one can marry a man can marry a woman, but not her sister, as long as the wife is still alive. If his wife, whether it's his wife or his ex-wife, if she dies, then he can marry the sister. So the Mishnah gave all sorts of possibilities of this happening. There was kind of number one, the whole halacha was unnecessary because there's an explicit verse in the Torah that says it, right? Right? Don't take a woman and her sister in her lifetime. So all that is explicit in a verse. And number two, why do you have to give all the possible permutations? Okay, you wonder why, right? The next Mishnah is going to give way more permutations, but anyway, we'll get to that when we get to it. But basically, we're going to have this interesting line. Amar Rav Yosef, kan shana Rebbe mishnah she'enat tzricha. Rav Yosef comes along and says, this is an example of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, when he put together the Mishnah, that he put in a Mishnah that's unnecessary. Okay, this whole section is totally unnecessary, number one, because it says it explicitly in the Torah. And even if you want to say, well, sometimes the Mishnah says something that says explicitly in the Torah, they certainly didn't need to go through every single possibility that it went through in the Mishnah. And therefore, this is a good example of where Rebbe brought something that's a Mishnah she'enat tzricha. I want to remind you that we already saw kan shana Rebbe a number of times in this Masechet. I still haven't managed to do good research on where that term appears, but I know it doesn't appear so many times. And I think I'm curious whether it appears particularly in Masechet Yevamot more than anywhere else, because it seems to keep commenting, right? And this is an indication that Rabbi, does the following things. One was that ethical comment about echad psula and echad kshera, that you shouldn't throw out your water when someone else needs it, right? Kind of musal, right? The moral lessons. We had other ones, right, where the get, right, where there's things that are derabba and things that are doraita. It's interesting that, right, we keep having this comment of here's an indicator of where Rebbe does the following thing. And with that, Hadran ala chacholetz, starting a new chapter. I feel like in Yevamot, especially we don't have siyums all the time. We have to really be happy every time we finish another chapter and move on to another. Okay. This one is going to be, like I said, a little bit more complicated. Rabban Gamliel Omer. First, we're going to start with the machloket. In fact, if you think things are a little bit confusing here, apparently Rashi also thought that you might think things were confusing. Rashi right away says, Rabban Gamliel Omer, Seder Mishnah zo shelo tit'el l'shabesh hagirsa b'sfarim. And he starts to organize right? This is the way the Mishnah is organized because it's really a little bit complicated. And when we get to this next line of Ketzad, he's going to point out that, by the way, this Ketzad has nothing to do with this first machloket. In other words, first is a machloket, Rabban Gamliel and the rabbis, which seems to be connected to the continuation, but Rashi says, no. It's a new thing when it gets to the word Ketzad. Usually Ketzad is to describe something discussed previously. Here it's going to be a little more confusing, and Rashi is going to say, oh no, it's not really referring to the earlier case. It's starting to just give you a whole bunch of situations. Okay, we're going to go into a ton of different situations. So Rabban Gamliel says, Ein get achar get, velo ma'amar achar ma'amar, velo be'ilah achar be'ilah, velo chalitza achar chalitza. This is one big long sentence that means a lot of different things. So let's start explaining. Ein get achar get. Now, remember we talked about if you give a get to your Yevamot. Now, normally you don't give a get to someone unless you're married to them. In this case, you're supposed to marry this woman. The brother's supposed to marry his brother's wife. If he decides to give her a get instead, right, we said it's a little bit weird because there's no meaning to a get if you're not married. On the other hand, there is this zika. There is this connection between them. Now, get doesn't undo the zika, okay, because you need chalitza, right? Get is not a possibility to fulfill the mitzvah of yibum. But there is valid meaning to this get. The rabbis said that if you give a get, well, there's certain things that happen when you give a wife a divorce document. Number one, you become forbidden to her relatives. So, well, that's because it's not that you became forbidden, it's that you were married to her. But even though you're divorced, you're still connected to her, and therefore you're forbidden to her relatives. If you give a get to this woman who was your Yevamah, the rabbis instituted that you're going to be forbidden to all her relatives. It's as if you were married, the same way we said with chalitza, right? If you do chalitza to her, it's as if you were married. So likewise, if you give her a get, it's as if you're married. This is just the concept of get. Forget about ein achar get. We're going to get to that soon. So first, I want to talk about the relevance of all these actions. So get has two relevant things. Number one, it's as if you were married to her, and therefore you're forbidden to her relatives. She's forbidden to your relatives. Number two, right, I'm saying you, even though most of you are women, but I mean the man, right, obviously. Now, if the husband gives her a get, now we have another issue, which is, remember this isur of lo yivneh, that you're not allowed to, if you didn't fulfill your brother's, right, you didn't build his house, you're no longer allowed to. So that means that normally it means if you did chalitza to one of the wives, you can't marry the other wife, right? Because you already did it. Or you can't decide to marry that woman because you already removed yourself from that. And it's chayve lavim, right? Remember chayve lavim, which Rabbi Akiva says, ein kiddushin tofsim b'chayve lavim. Everyone else disagrees with him, but we're going to see that our Mishnah follows him. Okay, so that means once you give her a get, you can't marry her, okay? Because we're now going to treat get like chalitza in this way. So if you gave her a get, you basically are saying, I want to disconnect. If you're saying I want to disconnect, then you're saying I'm not going to build my brother's family, which means you're no longer allowed to. So a bunch of things happen when you give a woman a get here, okay? Even though it's not a get because she's not married to you, but relatives and this issue of lo yivneh, okay? Now, ein get achar get means that let's say you gave one woman a get, one wife, there were two wives, and then you gave another wife a get. That second get does not forbid you to her relatives because it's not valid. You already gave a get. You already disconnected. There's no meaning anymore to another get. Okay. Now,
Okay, so Adina, you're asking, don't you still have to do chalitza? Yes, you haven't fulfilled your mitzvah of yibum. Okay, but the point is, you gave a get to one, you still have to do chalitza. If you give a get to the other one, that is a meaningless act. So you're not forbidden to your relatives at all because you haven't done anything. Because you already gave a get to one. There's no meaning after that to giving a get. Okay, that's what Rabban Gamliel says. Below ma'amar chamar. What's ma'amar? Ma'amar is the rabbis instituted a type of kiddushin ceremony, right? An engagement ceremony before the marriage, before the yibum, which is, consummating the relationship. So ma'amar is this early stage. What if you did ma'amar to one woman? Now, what does ma'amar do? It means that she's designated to you, which means a bunch of things. It means none of the other brothers can marry her at this point and fulfill the mitzvah of yibum. It means you can't marry any other wives, and neither can your brothers for that matter, because she's the one designated for yibum. So now, what if you did ma'amar to the second wife? Does that have any validity whatsoever? Comes Rabban Gamliel and says, no. Now, why is this relevant? Because again, ma'amar does similar to what get does. He's now going to be forbidden to her relatives because they've done a kiddushin, right, which already forbids to the relatives. And so what does this mean? And number two, the other thing that's important about ma'amal is that when you do ma'amal, let's say you decide you don't want to marry her. So what do you have to do? Do you remember? You still have to do chalitza because you haven't done yibum. And because ma'amar is like kiddushin, and you need a get from kiddushin, you need a get also. So in this case, if you did ma'amar to one and then ma'amar to the other, you need to do chalitza, okay? And you need a get from the first one, but the ma'amar, the second one would be totally irrelevant. So you wouldn't be forbidden to her relatives, and you wouldn't need a get from it. Okay, so that's the relevance of ein ma'amar chan ma'amar. V'lo bi'ilah har bi'ilah. If you have relations with one of the wives to fulfill the mitzvah of yibum, and then you have relations with another wife of this person, or another brother have relations with another wife, or another brother have relations with this Yevamot, it's called bi'ilat znut. It's just, engaging in a relationship that's forbidden. It's not like, oh, even if you betrothed her for this, you were doing it to kind of consummate a marriage, irrelevant because there is no marriage at this point. Because again, this is according to Rabbi Akiva, who says, Ein kiddushin tofsim b'chai ve'lavim. That means anything you do after be'ilah, right? If you do a be'ilah, and we're going to see anything you do after be'ilah, once you fulfill the mitzvah of yibum, there's no validity to any kiddushin that you will try to do with her or any of the other wives, because at this point it's all forbidden. And again, once it's chai ve'lavim, according to Rabbi Akiva, Ein kiddushin tofsim. You'll see Rashi says it, and also the Gemara is going to say later, Rashi based on the Gemara later, this Mishnah holds by Rabbi Akiva. V'lo chalitza har chalitza. If you did chalitza, once you did that, again, you've severed the relationship entirely. So if you do chalitza with another woman, that's a totally irrelevant action. So again, what would be the relevance? Remember we said, once you do chalitza, you're forbidden to all her relatives, and she's forbidden to your relatives. So again, that would be a relevance for it, okay? So it's an irrelevant action. Chachamim omrim, they disagree. Yesh get achar get, yesh ma'amar achar ma'amar. Aval lo achar bi'ilah, aval lo achar chalitza klum. Be'ilah and chalitza, they agree, since be'ilah is the kiyum of the mitzvah of yibum, and chalitza is a kiyum of the mitzvah of yibum. Again, it's an undoing of it, but it's fulfilling the obligation. Nothing after that is relevant. But get and ma'amar, remember, get and ma'amar only have validity on a rabbinic level, right? Not on a Torah level. Both of these are rabbinic that they have any relevance here. Obviously, get is not rabbinic, but get in this situation where you weren't even married to her has relevance only because it looks like chalitza, and therefore we want to consider it as if this is a significant action. Ma'amar also, there is no such thing in the Torah as ma'amar. So because of that, the rabbis say the relevance of get, if you do another get or you do another ma'amar, will also be valid. Okay, so they have a machloket about this. We'll get more into their machloket in tomorrow's daf. Now comes this ketzad that I mentioned before in Rashi, which is really not going on this machloket. Okay, it starts to describe situations. Rashi explains, if you look in Yesh Get Achar Get, it's the second wide line where the lines get a little bit wider. I'm sorry, not that one. Ketzad, it's the fourth line. Okay, fourth line. Oh, by the way, I should have read this Rashi also. When the rabbis say Yesh Get Achar Get, and this is, again, I told you, I want you to understand concepts here. That's what's the most important. Why is there get after get in the Chachamim's opinion? Because when you give a get, what are you doing? You're basically saying, I reject this woman, right? Now, if you did chalitza to her, then it would be a full rejection. And then, of course, anything you do is irrelevant. But in this case, a get is not a full disconnect from her. There's still zika there because you've done a weaker action to undo. You've undone the connection, which means, again, you can't marry anyone at this point in the family, right? Any of these women, but it's not fully. And therefore, you still have partial zika. And that's why another get would still be relevant. Because we talked about this before, this concept of chalitza psula. Remember when you do a chalitza after, let's say there was a get and then chalitza. We're going to get to this case later today. The chalitza is already a weaker chalitza because you've already somewhat undone the zika. And then, right, there's this chalitza. What's the issue? Remember, why is it a chalitza psula? Because you can't do yibum. If you can't do yibum, your chalitza is weaker. So again, like there's all these situations where you might have a weaker action and it might not necessarily work as well. You'll see that they seem to think chalitza psula would work enough, but get for sure wouldn't. So because get is weak, it's not enough to get rid of the zika. That means if you give another get to the other woman, it does have relevance according to the rabbis. Okay, so now we get to this word ketzad, and let's look again in Rashi, fourth wide line here, or mid-sized line. Lav aplutekai. This is not referring to the machloket before. Elamilta ba'am pei nafshi. It's a new thing. They didn't tell you this in the Mishnah, but he's telling you this first case. We're going to discuss a bunch of permutations. We're now talking about and permutations in terms of the relationships, how many people there are, how many Yevamim, how many Yevamot. We're going to start with 1 and 1. Then we're going to get to 1 and 2 and 2 and 1. Okay. And Hachi Kamar, Ketzad Din Yavam v'Yavama. Okay. And now they're going to explain what happens if you have 1 Yavam and 1 Yavama. And if, like, these are all if situations. If you did this and then that, what would have to happen? Or if you did this, what would have to happen? Ketzad. So we're going to start simple and build on it. Asama Amar b'Yivimto v'Natan Laget. He does ma'amal with the Yevamah. So again, we have 1 Yavam, 1 Yevamah, very simple. I didn't even do presentations because it's very easy to understand without that. So he does ma'amar to the woman, and then he does get. Remember, the get undoes the ma'amar. If you do ma'amal and you decide not to marry her, you have to give her a get in addition to chalitza. So that's exactly what the Mishnah says. Vinatan get, right? Now again, he can't marry her at this point, so he has to give her a get, but he still hasn't fulfilled his mitzvah of yibum. So she has to do chalitza, or he has to do chalitza with her. Asama amar v'chalitza. Let's say he does ma'amal and then he does chalitza to undo it. We already said chalitza deals with your yibum obligation, but it doesn't deal with the fact that you've done a type of kiddushin with this woman. You need to undo that with a get, and therefore it's tzricha himenu get. So far, so good. Asama amar uba'al. Let's say he does ma'amar and then he has intercourse with the woman. That is clearly harezo k'mitzvata. That's perfect. It's exactly how you do yibum. Okay, so that's a perfect, right? It's the only one you're going to see in the Mishnah that was perfectly done. Everything else was done in a kind of, I would say, a little bit cockamamie way, right? But not exactly the way it was supposed to happen. Natan get the asama amal. Okay, here's a bit of a weird order. He gives her a get, and then he does ma'amar, like he wants to marry her. Now remember, he can't marry her because he gave her a get already. That means Isur of lo yivneh kicks in. He can no longer marry anyone here. Tzricha get v'chalitza. Okay, according to this, she still needs a get from the ma'amar because he did do ma'amar, even though really theoretically he couldn't have, and needs chalitza. Okay, just 1 second. Right, so let's look at Rashi for a minute there. Natan get ba'asama amal, bo'ta yevama atzma. We're talking about he did yevama, right, ma'amar with the one he gave because we're all talking about one case. Even Rabban Gamliel moded yesh ma'amar achar get. Okay, here we still think there is ma'amar after get. Okay, because, yes, after ma'amar, you in general need a get. And even if you gave a get first and then you did ma'amar, you're still going to need a get to undo the ma'amar. That's what this is basically saying. Okay, now, next. Natan get, asama amal, tzricha get en chalitza, obviously, because he still hasn't taken care of the yibum. Natan get uba'al, tzricha get v'chalitza. This is very similar to ma'amar. Except that this time he did bi'ilah. He had intercourse with her after giving her the get. Now, this is forbidden. He's not allowed to. But because he did it, he needs to undo it. How does he undo it? He needs a get to undo it. But he can't stay married to her. And he didn't fulfill the mitzvah of yibum because he gave her a get first and severed the ties. And it was forbidden to him. So therefore, he needs to do chalitza as well. She, right? They both need to do chalitza. Natan get v'chalatz. He gives her a get, and then he does chalitza. Well, that's fine, because even though the get right now, here's the issue of the chalitza psula. This is what you would call a chalitza psula, because he can't do yibum,
because he gave her a get. So they're not allowed to get married. But so the chalitza is weak, but in any case, they say this still undoes the zika entirely. Okay, according to this opinion, chalitza is enough no matter what. We'll see later, there's a bit of a machloket about this. Chalatz v'asama amal. Okay, and you'll hear it's a little tricky because it says viv, but it really means oh. Okay, we're now going to have, he starts with chalitza. And then, okay, we basically have four things going on, right? There's chalitza, ma'amal, get, and bi'ilah. So now we're going to basically go through. He does chalitza first, and then he does one of the others. He does or ma'amal, natan get, or ba'al. Okay, he does one of the other three after chalitza was already done. Now remember, we said ein achar chalitza klum, and that's what they're going to say. Okay, in a minute they're going to say that, which is you've finished yibum entirely. You're done. Okay, and now you can no longer marry. Since you can no longer marry, there's no meaning to anything you do that seems to be like a marriage type thing, whether it's bi'ilah or ma'amal or even giving a get is obviously a useless thing. You're not forbidden to your relatives anymore, of course, because you've already done chalitza. There's no connection. It's like giving a get to a random woman on the street, right? You have no connection to her. That doesn't mean anything. So again, you wouldn't be forbidden to her. I mean, you're forbidden to her relatives anyway because you did chalitza to her. But if there's any sort of relevance, right, the get isn't really so relevant why that would be important. But the point is, if you did ma'amar or ba'al, you wouldn't be considered married to her in any way, shape, or form. And again, this follows Rabbi Akiva, that when there's chayve lavim, which is what there is here, because lo yivneh, you can no longer marry her, then since you can't marry her anymore, that's why there's no validity to any action you would do. O ba'al, or we're going to see not only chalitza, and this we saw before, bi'ilah also. Once you consummate the yibum relationship, then you did ma'amal or natan get or chalatz and achar chalitza klum. Now here it's a little bit weird. The commentaries all say what it really means to say is en achar chalitza klum ve'en achar bi'ilah klum. Okay, that's really what it should read. Okay, and the Gemara is going to say why doesn't it say that? We're going to get to that, not today. So the point is, right, if you did all these things, right, you don't need anything else to do. Okay, so for example, right, you wouldn't need to do chalitza after. Okay, like if you gave a get, normally we say giving a get is not enough, you need chalitza. But in this case, you did bi'ilah first, so you obviously don't need chalitza anymore. And ma'amar would be irrelevant because you already did chalitza with her, right? Yeah, bi'ilah, right? You already had intercourse with her. That means you consummated the yibum relationship. So anything after that is basically irrelevant. Okay, now, what it also means is that once you do the bi'ilah, there's no more zika. I mean, obviously there's no more zika. There's more than zika. You're related. Okay, this all, like I said, was one Yevamot and one Yabam, where he did the right multiple actions to one woman. Now we're going to say, and the same thing would be true. It's just going to be a bit more complicated, but not really. It's the same principles, exactly the same. Okay, and here we're going to bring up the presentation. Okay, so if you have two Yevamot and one Yabam, okay, so here goes. Okay, we're now going to go through all the cases that would be. So we start off with Reuven is married to Yael and Shula. We're going to have a case where there's one Yabam, his brother Shimon, and two Yevamot, Yael and Shula. So now Reuven dies, our classic case, and Shula and Yael fall to Yibum to Shimon. So now we're going to go through one by one. Asam ma'amar bezo u'ma'amar bezo. Shimon does ma'amar with Yael, and then afterwards he does ma'amar with Shula. Tzrichot shnei gitin v'chalitza. Okay, so both of them need a get because he did ma'amar with them, and to undo ma'amar, you need a get. And he needs to do chalitza. Now, every time there's chalitza, I did hear possibility 1 and possibility 2, because it's not particularly any one that needs chalitza. It's not the first one he did ma'amar with, he has to do chalitza with. It's either one of them can do chalitza because he just has to do chalitza with one of them. So either he does it with Yael or he does it with Shula. Next. Because remember, the get and the ma'amar don't deal with the yibum obligation directly, right? Unless he were to have married her. But if he didn't marry her, then he has to undo it with chalitza. And in this, right, so now, in this case, again, I want to remind you, because he did ma'amar with each, yibum is no longer an option. Because once you do ma'amar with one, you're forbidden to marry the other. In this case, he did ma'amar with both, so he's forbidden to marry each of them. And that's why the only possibility is to do chalitza. And obviously then to undo the ma'amar, he's going to need to give them each a get. Next. Okay, so if you didn't get all the details until now, hopefully each time we go through this, it'll become more clear, all the details. Ma'amar bezo v'get bezo. So again, we have our same situation. This time Shimon does ma'amar with Yael, same thing.
But instead of doing ma'amar with shula, for some, again, we don't know why he does this, but he gives shula a get. Okay, get lizo. Right? Obviously, he was a little confused about what he was supposed to be doing. So if he gave her a get, now what does he need? So with shula, he can't marry her because he did ma'amar with Yael. And he also did a get, so he's not really connected to her much more, but he is still connected because the Yibum obligation is still there. He hasn't fulfilled it. And he can't marry Yael because he gave a get to Shula, and that forbids him lo yivneh, right? He already said, I'm not building my brother's house by giving her a get. So now he can't marry Yael either. So again, what do we need? Tzricha get. Who needs a get? Well, the one who did ma'amar needs a get. Obviously, the one who got a get doesn't need a get anymore. So Yael needs a get, and chalitza. Again, chalitza, possibility number one, he does chalitza with Shula. Possibility number two, he does chalitza with Yael. It doesn't really make a difference. Okay, next. Ma'amar bizo, because remember, you might have said, he should do it with Yael. He did ma'amar with her, but he already undid the ma'amar by giving the get, right? The get is the undoing of the ma'amar, not the chalitza. Ma'amar bizo uba'alet zo. Okay, so now he does ma'amar with Yael again. Then he has intercourse with Shula. At this point, what does he need? Tzrichot shnei gitin vechalitza, right? They both need a get and chalitza, either for Yael or for Shula. Again, it doesn't matter. Ma'amar bizo v'chalatz lezo. Okay, he does ma'amar with Yael, and then he does chalitza with Shula. You can see we started with ma'amar to Yael, and we're just basically going through all the possibilities of having done one of the other actions with Shula. So now he does chalitza with Shula. So now, obviously, according to Yibum laws, he's finished. But as we said before, you still have to undo the ma'amar by giving a get. So harishonat tzricha get. That's all that's left to do. Yael needs a get. Get lizo v'get lizo. Now we're starting with get. He starts off, he gives Yael a get, and then he gives a get to Shula afterwards. So again, what do we say? Get severs the ties in terms of get. Like you don't need any more than that, but you still need chalitza because you haven't gotten rid of Yibum yet. So she has to do chalitza, right? Either Yael or Shula. And that's it for that case. Notice, by the way, they're not really talking here about, are you forbidden to the relatives, right? Is there get achar get, ma'amar achar ma'amar? This does seem to say that there is ma'amar after ma'amar, because we saw in the beginning, right, that he did ma'amar to both and they both needed a get. So this seems to obviously follow the opinion that yesh ma'amar achar ma'amar. There is validity to a second one. Okay, get lizo ba'aletzo. He gives Yael a get, and then he has intercourse with Shula. So again, what did we say? The be'ilah, you need to do a get. You need to get a get from that. So tzricha get, Shula needs a get. Yael obviously doesn't because she already has a get. And chalitza, again, possibility 1 or 2. It doesn't matter which one he does chalitza with. Next case, get lizo u'ma'amar bizo. Gives a get to Yael and ma'amar with Shula. Tzricha get v'chalitza. So now because you did ma'amar with Shula, to undo the ma'amar, you need a get. Again, this is pretty straightforward at this point. And Yael needs chalitza or Shula needs chalitza. It doesn't matter which one. One of them needs chalitza because you haven't yet dealt with the chalitza obligation. Because again, get and ma'amar don't do anything when it comes to chalitza. Get lizo, v'chalatz lizo. Okay, again, he gives Yael a get, and then he does chalitza with Shula. So now, what did we say? Ein achar chalitza, klum. Okay, there's nothing after chalitza. Again, this has a bunch of meanings. This means, number one, there's no need for anything more in terms of your Yibum obligation because you fulfilled it, right? So you don't have to worry about doing chalitza anymore because you already did it, right? It's kind of obvious. And according to Rabbi Akiva, if Shimon would now decide to marry Yael, he would not be allowed to. And not only that, the kiddushin wouldn't be valid. So for example, if he wants to divorce her, he wouldn't need to because they're not actually married. Because there's no, remember, Chai ve'lavin. Once he does chalitza with Shula, he's forbidden to marry Yael. Again, once he even did the get with Yael, he's forbidden to marry her, but all the more so with Shula. And therefore, any kind of relationship that would happen after this would be an invalid relationship. It wouldn't be a relevant one. Chalatz v'chalatz. Okay, now already don't look at the presentation yet. This is just, if he did chalitza, I didn't bother showing this because it's kind of obvious. He does chalitza with the first and chalitza with the second. Okay. Oh, chalatz, or he did chalitza, and now we're going to do all the permutations, right? Then he does ma'amal, or natan get, or baal, which we already said, ein achar chalitza klum, so all that's irrelevant. O baal, or he has relations, right? Intercourse with one of them, and then baal, the second one, or baal v'asa ma'amal, or natan get, or chalatz. Remember, ein achar chalitza klum and ein achar be'ilah klum, meaning as soon as he fulfilled the mitzvah of Yibum, either through chalitza or through Yibum, nothing else is relevant, right? The get won't forbid to the relatives because there is no get. There's no connection between them anymore. There's no zika. A get is totally irrelevant, right? Ma'amar won't be relevant because that's only relevant if, right, he can marry her. He can't marry her now because he already did chalitza or be'ila with one, right? Now he's forbidden to marry any others. So basically that would all be irrelevant. Now, here we get to the next one in the presentation. That was all Bein Yabam Echad L'Shnei Yevamot. That was what we had. One Yabam with two wives. Bein Shnei Yevamim L'Yevama Achat. All this would be the same, and we're not going to go through. I'm going to spare you going through every single case, but I brought one as an example. You can have all these cases, and now you kind of have to go back to the beginning, but it's not really so necessary because it's kind of obvious. All instead of Shimon doing first to Yael and then to Shula, we have Reuven had one wife, Yael, but two brothers, Shimon and Levi. And then we have, what if he did one action? And then one brother did one, Shimon did one to Yael, and then Levi did the next action. So here we took the example of chalatz v'chalatz. So if Shimon did chalitza to Yael, and then came along Levi and he did chalitza to Yael, ein achar chalitza klum, right? We basically say, right, Levi is permitted to Yael's relatives because he basically did nothing with her, right? It's an irrelevant action. It has no ramifications whatsoever. Okay, so that's basically all the cases that we've seen so far. Okay, that's the end of today's presentation, but there is more to do in the Mishnah, and then we'll get to the Gemara. Chalatz v'asama amal. Okay, now if he did chalitza and then did ma'amal or natan get uba'al, this is just repetition of what we saw already, but we're going to go one step farther. We're going to basically limit this halacha. So this is the easy halacha, which is basically you do chalitza or you do bi'ilah, intercourse, you're done, right? That's it. Nothing after that. So that's what we're going to just quote right now. So we're just going to read it inside. Chalatz v'asama amal or natan get uba'al, right? He did all the other possibilities. Or o ba'al v'asama amal v'natan get b'chalatz. Okay, so if he started with chalitza and did all these other things, or he started with be'ila and then did all these other things, there's no relevance, right? Again, it should be ein achar chalitza or ein achar be'ila klum. Now here comes the important part. Bein b'tchila, bein b'emtza, bein b'sof. This concept of ein achar chalitza klum or ein achar be'ila klum, well, now we're going to see. Right now they're going to say ein achar chalitza klum. Doesn't matter whether chalitza was the first action he did or the second or the third. Let's say there were three brothers, and the first one did ma'amar, the second one gave a get, and the third one did chalitza. Ein achar chalitza klum. Even though we've learned that that's a chalitza psula, remember? That's what the chiddush is here. Even though it's a weaker chalitza, and that was that whole sugya we learned a long time ago. If it's a weaker chalitza, remember we said sometimes maybe both brothers need to do chalitza to get rid of the zika because maybe the chalitza psula, again, is a case where you can't marry the woman. So if he gave a get first and then did chalitza, that would be a chalitza psula. Comes this opinion and says it doesn't matter. Still, ein achar chalitza klum. Even though it's a chalitza psula, it's sufficient to get rid of any zika there is, and therefore no action is relevant after that. V'habi'ilah, and if you have intercourse, bizman shi b'tchila, we're now going to distinguish. If it's b'tchila, ein acharei klum. But ba'emtza uvasof, yesh acharei klum. But if you did some action first, now this makes sense. Once you do some other action, it's already, you're not allowed to marry her. Remember, let's say you give her a get, or you did ma'amar to one, and then you do bi'ilah with the other. You're not allowed to. So there we don't say ein achar bi'ilah klum. It's only if the bi'ilah was the first thing you did, then you fulfill the mitzvah of yibum. But if it was already forbidden for you to do yibum with her and you did it, that would not work. Rabbi Nechemia Omer, he has a different approach. Echa bi'ilah, echa chalitza. It's all the same. Bein b'tchila, bein b'emtza, bein b'sof, ein acharei klum. He says even a bi'ilah in the middle is considered a bi'ilah of mitzvah. At that point, you fulfilled your mitzvah of yibum. There's nothing after that. Okay, and therefore he says, for example, if you look in the last Rashi before you get to the Gemara, v'nafka beget ubelo chalitza. Okay, she would leave the marriage with a get. There would be no need for chalitza anymore because the yibum would have been would work. And second relevance, if he betrothed some with the other sister, the other wife, let's say, or a different brother betrothed her afterwards, that would be right. We would say it's nothing. It's an irrelevant action because he's already done bi'ilah with this one. Okay, so that's what Rabbi Nechemia. Now the Gemara is going to go into four things here. First, we're going, or maybe it's four, maybe not. I think it's four. The Gemara starts off with Ad kan lo pligi, goes back to this machloket yesh get achar get, ein get achar get from the beginning of the Mishnah, Rabban Gamliel and the rabbis. Ad kan lo pligi ela beget achar get umamar achar ma'amar. Notice the machloket was when you did a get and then a get, ma'amar and then ma'amar, the exact same action twice.
Right? It sounds like Shabbat, ein bishul achar bishul, right? Once you do bishul, you do another cooking, it doesn't mean anything. So here, that's what they were talking about. Aval, get echa b'yevama, ma'amar echa b'yevama mahane. This is just something we've learned many times. What they're trying to say is if you gave a get to the first woman, though, that would be relevant. Now, why did I have to tell you this? Because it's a little bit weird that it's relevant. Again, they weren't married. What does get have to do with a woman who wasn't married to a man? So they're trying to tell you here, get works. And in a minute, they're going to tell you why. And also, ma'amar works, even though theoretically by Torah law, you're supposed to do yibum. Ma'amar works, again, what does it work to do? It works to say you're connected to this woman. It works to say you can't now marry any of the other wives. It works to say your brothers can't marry her or any of the other wives, right? It has tokef, as we say. It has a certain amount of something happened here, even though theoretically, right, maybe it wouldn't have, okay? I'm going to read something in Rashi here. Right, Mahani Gepi Vama, right? Also, right, to say lo yivneh, right? That again, get also works to say you can no longer marry anybody else here as well. And ma'amar b'yivama mahani la'ala tzricha. Right. And also, I knew I wanted to Rashi. I was going to forget this. That you need a get for the ma'amar also, right? It's not enough to just undo the ma'amar and say, oh, I'm not interested. I'll do chalitza. Chalitza is not enough. You're going to need a get as well. So why do these things have such validity, right? Why wouldn't chalitza undo ma'amar? Theoretically, chalitza is the undoing of your relationship. It should work. So we're going to now ask the question on each. My time, Amar Rabbanan get b'yevama mahane. So why would everyone agree that a get works? So mishum de mahane ba'alma. Okay, so get in general works with a regular woman, right, who's married. And therefore, de'i amart lo mahane, if we think this get has no relevance, Amre, get lahotzia v'chalitza lahotzia. People will make that comparison. They'll say, look, chalitza is like a get, right? Get undoes a marriage. Chalitza undoes a yibum. Umi de get lo mahane. Now, if they would look at this thing and they'd say, hey, this guy gave her a get, but it's a useless act. It doesn't have any relevance whatsoever. If you were to say that, people might think the chalitza nami lo mahane. Now, for what? They might think that chalitza, now what does get do? Remember? It forbids you. It's as if you basically said, I'm not building my brother's house, which means you're now forbidden to. If we allowed you to do it, let's say you gave a get, and then we said, it's irrelevant. You can now go marry her if you want. Then people will think that you can do the same thing with chalitza, because they'll confuse chalitza and get. And they'll say, if you did chalitza, you can also marry her after. And and they might think, right? You might think I could go marry her or I could go marry the other wife. Okay. And we know it's forbidden. So because of that, they forbade also get. So it's a gzera de Rabbanan in case we might come to some incorrect conclusion. Second question. My time Amar Rabbanan ma'amar b'yevama mahane. Why does ma'amar is strong enough to basically forbid you to marry anybody else and require you to get a get and all that? Mishum de mahane ba'alma. Because again, kiddushin in general works. So now let's figure out what the gzera is. Di amar lo mahane. If you say this wouldn't work, amre ma'amar liknot ubiya liknot. You would say, look, ma'amar works to be koneh in a Yevama. And what else works? Intercourse, right? That's the whole way you fulfill Yibum. That's on a Torah level. Ma'amar is only on a Rabbanan level. If you would say, mi de ma'amar lo mahane, if you'd say ma'amar doesn't stop you from marrying the other wife, you could go marry the other wife if you want. Bi'anami lo mahane, ba'ati l'mival achar bia. You might think maybe having relations with this woman doesn't forbid me from also marrying the tzacha. This is all a concern that you're going to now do something else with the second wife. So because of that, they forbid. Umay time Amar Rabbanan, right? I said there's four things we're trying to figure out. So we figured out Yevama, why get works by Yevama. Now we figured out why Ma'amar is effective to forbid you to the other women. Now, my time Amar Rabbanan, bi'a psula yesh acharei klum. Why did the rabbis say bi'a psula, meaning if you did it after a get, where you're not allowed to marry her, and then you have intercourse with her anyway, it's not strong enough, right? There is validity to things that go on after that. You still need chalitza, let's say. Amre, ibia achar geti, gzera bia achar get, mishum bia achar chalitza. Well, there's two different options. Either you gave a get and then did the intercourse. If you did that, we're going to say, well, you might have thought, right, we're going to make a gzera, bia after get, mishum bia achar chalitza. Since bia, again, every time we substitute get with chalitza. Since get is like chalitza, if you did chalitza and then bi'ilah, right, intercourse after, that would be a problem. Therefore, we're going to forbid it after get also. We're going to say, or it's not a valid bi'ah. Vi'i bi'ah achar ma'amar, if it was first ma'amar and then you did bi'ah with the other one, gzera bi'ah achar ma'amar, mishum bi'ah achar bi'ah. Again,
Ma'amar is like bi'ah. We said before, you might confuse the two since both of them affect some connection between you and the Yevamot. Therefore, since bi'ah har bi'ah would be a problem, if you did bi'ah with one, you can't do bi'ah with the other. Therefore, we forbid bi'ah har ma'amar. My time, and again, we say it's not a relevant, right? It's not a fulfillment of the mitzvah of Yibum. My time, I'm a Rabbanit, because remember, the rabbis distinguish between bi'ah achar, right? Bi'ah and achar, bi'ila in the middle doesn't work. Chalitza would work. So now we want to know, why does chalitza work? Hi, chalitza psula and achara klum, right? Why did they say? Normally you'd say chalitza is a weaker. You can't do yibum, so the chalitza is weaker. Maybe it's not enough to get rid of the zika, but the rabbi said it doesn't matter. It's fine if you do, what makes it weaker? If you did a ma'amar and then you did a chalitza, or you did a get and then you did a chalitza, it's weaker. So, hi chalitza psula and achara klum. Why? Amrei my ligzor. There's no reason for any xera. Why? Two options of why you would be gozer. Nigzor chalitza achar get mishum chalitza achar chalitza. Right? In other words, get and chalitza always interchange. So let's say chalitza after chalitza. Well, it's not really a problem. Chalitza after chalitza isn't even a problem. Therefore, chalitza after get isn't going to be a problem. Why is chalitza after chalitza not a problem? Kol kiane tachlot v'tezel. We've already seen this before. So what if you do chalitza a second time? It's a meaningless activity. It certainly doesn't mess up anything. So we're no reason to make xera there. And ligzor chalitza achar ma'amar, last line for today. What about chalitza after ma'amar? Well, ma'amar mishum chalitza, right? You might say mishum chalitza achar bi'ah. Always bi'ah and ma'amar are going to switch. So maybe do it because of chalitza after bi'ah. Atu chalitza achar ma'amar milo baya get lema'amaro. Chalitza achar bi'ah nami baya get lebi'ato. Since what already they require the same thing. If you do bi'ah and you do ma'amar, what do you need to undo it? You need to get. It's the exact same thing. So there's no reason to make any more xera here. It's already got the same issues in going on there. You don't need more than a get to get rid of. Right? If you do chalitza after bi'ah, right, you don't need yibum anymore. There's no, right, you've already done yibum, right? You've already done bi'ah and you do chalitza after. The only thing you need to undo that bi'ah would be if you want to get divorced, but you've already fulfilled your mitzvah of yibum. So there's nothing more to be gozer here. So therefore, after ma'amar, it also doesn't require any more than just a simple get, which you would anyway have needed with bi'ah. So therefore, in this case, there's no reason to be gozer. That's why chalitza after bi'ah or after ma'amar doesn't require anything further. Okay, that's the end of today's stuff. I know it was a little complicated, but again, the concepts are what's important, like the fact that a get creates this relationship, that you're forbidden to her relatives, that you now can't do lo yivnet, right? You can't marry her anymore, and the ramifications of that, right? All these issues, the ma'amar means now you can't marry anyone else, right? In the family, or all these things. Those are the important things to take out of today's stuff if you didn't get every single example and what you would do in that situation. Again, they're very theoretical situations that any of these would actually happen. They're just trying to get to the concepts behind it all. Have a great day.